This month's theme is cultivating relationships. And you heard from the Time for All Ages video that there was a handy guide to our 7 principles. So now the children are taking that back to their classroom to learn more specifically about the 3rd principle, building relationships through learning and growing together. Well, ours is a much more complex conversation, overcoming tribalism. And with that, I need to start with a story. Karen came into my office and she'd clearly had enough. She was generally concerned about how people these days are treating us so poorly, but particularly in social media. She cited something that she had witnessed on Facebook that had set her off and made the appointment to come see me. And she said that frankly, there's such strong and partisan postings from people, her family, friends, colleagues, that she thought wouldn't be involved like that. People she thought would rise above it, and she was very disappointed. Well, my response in my head was, I've heard this before. Over the last 4, 5, 6 years, every now and then people just need a confidential listening ear to come and vent their frustration over what's going on in our society, so then they can go back out in the world and keep on keeping on. So I was listening, and then with one comment, the conversation came to a screeching halt. Karen said, it's nothing more than pure tribalism. And I sat up and went, what? Tribalism? Where did that come from? What is tribalism? Tell me more about this. What are you talking about? And that's when Karen introduced me to Wright, an American journalist and author who writes about science, history, politics, and religion. He's written 5 books with amazing titles of 3 Scientists and Their Gods, Looking for Meaning in an Age of Information, The Moral Animal, Non-Zero, The Logic of Human Destiny, The Evolution of God, and Why Buddhism is True. So as a budding Unitarian Universalist minister, I had to take notice of this guy and learn more about him and what he has to say. So Karen led me to a series of podcasts that were collected into an audiobook called How Mindfulness Can Heal the World, Evolving Beyond Tribalism. I'll say it again. How Mindfulness Can Heal the World, Evolving Beyond Tribalism. It's just 6 chapters, but it is filled with insight and ideas. In fact, it's so packed with insight and ideas, I decided I needed to use it as the basis for a sermon today, as well as invite you to a follow-up study group, discussion group, a week from next Tuesday. So it went out in the announcements last week that I'm offering an October virtual discussion group on Tuesday, October 19th at 6:30. You can find it in the announcements. You can go out onto the website calendar and you'll see it. A week from Tuesday at 6:30, a follow-up discussion on the whole book and what he has to say. There is a Zoom link embedded. You don't even have to go anywhere. It'll be all 3 fellowships, and whoever wants to come, we can talk for about an hour and a half of how we felt about the book. So I invite you to join me for a further discussion on this to help us cultivate relationships this month. So back to business. What does Wright mean by tribalism? And why is this even so important? Well, he says tribalism can be blamed for the extreme bitterness in our society these days. And by that, he means people having such strong opinions that it's bringing anger and spitefulness towards other groups. In fact, tribalism often blinds folks completely about any kind of redeeming features that another group may have. Now, he cites in his audiobook, and I want to cite it today, that there are problems using this term tribalism. And I apologize today, particularly for using this term, given that tomorrow is Indigenous Peoples Day. The Indigenous peoples on this continent live in tribes, as do many groups of people throughout the world. And this is not about them. This is a universal term used for this kind of behavior. And Wright said if he had a different term that he could use, he would have used it. This is not about ethnic conflict, and it's not referring to any particular group of people. But Wright does say we are groupish by nature. We are tribal by nature, if that's the term we're going to use. And he explains it through evolutionary psychology. He says that natural selection has created a mind that is susceptible to distortions that come with tribalism. Now, that doesn't make any sense. Why doesn't natural selection create minds which are really good at clarity and perception? After all, if you're about to be in danger or you're going to run over a cliff or hit a tree or something, it would be really nice to be really clear and perceive that that's about to happen. But that isn't how our minds work. And this is all from the theory of natural selection. So let's talk about that for a second. The traits that are best at getting into the genes of the next generation are the, quote, most fit. Most fit is not a definition that has anything to do with what's most appreciated or most useful in the 21st century. It had to do with which were most aggressive or cunning in getting their genes passed on. So be that as it may, we have minds that are not really always good at clarity. The genes that flourished by altering perceptions and then winning is what happened. Think of this. Think of an example that Wright gives that we've all experienced, I'm sure. You're about to cross a busy street, and there's no stop sign, there's no traffic lights, there's no one directing traffic. You're on your own to figure out how to get across. And you're watching the traffic go back and forth, and you're trying to estimate the speed with which these cars are coming so that you can get by safely. So you step into the street, you think there's a gap here between the cars, between the traffic, and you scurry along pretty much as fast as you can to make sure that you're on the other side for safety. And don't you feel this way? Inevitably, I get to the other side and you say, well, wait, that car was clearly coming a lot less quickly than I thought. I didn't need to run. I could have tripped. That was probably a bad idea. Well, apparently, that is a universal perception, that we are built to move quickly when in danger. And if you think about it, if the hungry lion's headed your way, our brain's it's not a good time to sit there and ponder what we should do and then start running at the last second. It's kind of our brain perceives that the danger is more imminent than it is and gives us a head start. So it kind of makes sense, but it doesn't help favor clarity of perception. So then we have this built-in distortion, but then how does tribalism as a cognitive bias, as a thinking bias, develop in evolution? Well, here again, the arguments and disagreements back in primordial days had real genetic stakes. If you didn't win the day, your genetics were not going to be passed on probably. The example given was arguing over food and resources. That had big consequences. If you lost, you might be banished from the tribe or might not get enough to survive and live. So therefore, if you convinced others that you had a very important role somehow, you would get more food, you'd get more shelter, you'd get more opportunity, you'd get more protection, and more likely to survive. So here again, evolutionary psychology and the studies that they've done show that we are also naturally prone to overestimate our value. We exaggerate how much we are entitled to. We take credit for all the good things that happen to us and assume that if something bad comes along, it was caused by someone else, something else, some external force. It couldn't have been anything that we caused to happen. We also think that we are morally better than the average. Every time they do a survey and they change it up so it's a different circumstance, but every time the outcome is the same, that we all believe we're morally better than the average. Well, that's mathematically impossible. Then there is no average. But we all believe that we're morally better than the average, and better yet, Wright points out, we recognize that this bias exists and that this behavior exists, but we don't think we're a part of it. We're better than that. So he laughs and he says, we even think we're better than others at managing our cognitive biases. Well, these biases don't just play out at an individual level, of course. They play out at a group level, and that's what causes tribalism. A group of people believes that they are morally superior to someone else, or they are just superior in many ways than others. So the thing of it is, this has been around forever, but the ugliness of this tribalism has been magnified 1,000-fold because of the internet and social media. And frankly, my friends, we should care about tribalism because tribalism is now ripping apart our world. Well, Wright says that Buddhism has a lot to say about these cognitive distortions and what can be done about it. He tells a story about a weed, and so I have my own story that I wanted to share. Many of you know that I recently bought a home and I'm in the process of moving into it. And after I purchased it, I went into the backyard again to kind of look at it more closely and see what I supposedly own now. And I was dismayed to find that the backyard is about 10% grass, about 10% clover, and about 80% creeping Charlie. And when I discovered that, immediately these revulsive emotions just came up within me. And it dates back to when I was an early teen. I mowed a lot of lawns for money. And back then, people didn't spray things so much and use a lot of herbicides. So a lot of people had creeping Charlie in their yards. And when I would mow over it, the smell would come up that I just thought was revolting. So when I saw that I had this backyard that was mostly creeping Charlie, I immediately started thinking about how can I kill it. Now, I'm a more enlightened person these days, and I don't want to just use Roundup or herbicides. So I was trying to think of all the other ways that I could eliminate this weed from my yard. I called it this weed. I was telling this story to my friend Crystal. Crystal is an herbalist. Crystal spends almost every weekend in the woods somewhere, gathering herbs and plants and bark and mushrooms and things like that, and creates all kinds of tinctures and herbal teas that are healing and soothing. And that's how she views the world. And she looked at me just aghast and said, "You know, Jim, creeping Charlie is an ivy. It's in the mint family, and you can take the leaves and brew this just wonderful medicinal tea." I was shocked. I was shocked that anybody would think of something that I thought as this my enemy, this weed, and think of it as a friend and medicinal. So Buddhist writings talk about this, that we tend to convey our feelings onto something and it doesn't belong there. And our senses essentially lie to us. Again, the quote that I read earlier, the evidence of the senses. The senses' evidence and works inspire such scorn from others and such smug conviction he is right that all his rivals rank as sorry, brainless fools. Well, this bias can lead to this essence of enemy that I've attributed them. They're an enemy. They can't get out of that enemy box because I not only want my tribe, they're a different tribe, but I've attributed or assumed an essence of enemy on them. Well, that essence of enemy can cause me to have this deeper cognitive bias that plays out all the time. Think about, I'll give the example that Wright gave us. You are responsible for taking a child to a playground. You might be the parent, the grandparent, the babysitter, someone, and you take this child to the playground, and another child is mean to your child. It tends to be that immediately you think of that child as bad. That child hasn't been brought up right. That parent or guardian isn't paying attention to that child. That shouldn't have happened, and you want to take your child by the hand and move them to a different space and protect them. And when you go home, you're going to tell the parents that there's this kid in the neighborhood who's just mean, and you need to be careful and stay away from him. What that's called is attribution bias. It means that you have decided that they are a bad person. It is in the core of their character. It's one of their attributes that they are a bad person. This is part of this essence of enemy. Once you've been labeled that it's one of your attributes, you can't get out of that box. Now, the opposite is your own child. Your own child is mean to some other child in the playground, and you don't think of it as a bad child. You think of your child as didn't get a nap today, didn't have enough to eat for lunch, and it's about time for a snack, or they have an earache coming on, something like that. You have something to say that it's just in their disposition, their mood for the day is causing the bad behavior. So already, based on how you think of the world, what essence you give to them, whether it's, in my case, this essence of weed, an enemy for Creeping Charlie, or an essence of friend and medicinal for Creeping Charlie, then causes you to have these other cognitive biases. Well, there's a lot to do with feelings and cognitive bias. And this kind of dates back to Western thinking with Plato. And the image there has to do with a chariot driver and horses. The chariot driver is our brain, is our cognition. And the horses are like, the image is usually wild horses, wild emotion. And they would be running wild if they were not hitched up to the chariot. And the only way that this works out is if the mind, cognition, the chariot driver, has the reins in his hand and is firmly in control of these horses. And that's the image of how we think of feelings and cognition. It's definitely separate, but one rules over the other. Well, that's been Western thinking for centuries, and it turns out it's far more complicated than that, and it's difficult, actually, for us to separate the two, and now particularly on social media. If you think about it, we have a built-in motivation to keep animosity going. We want to please our tribe. It makes us feel good. We get a pat on the back, virtually, if you will. So if I see something out there, either on social media or in the news, that I just think is abhorrent and points out how ludicrous the opponent is, I immediately want to grab it, copy it, and post it, like in Facebook, because I know that my friends will see that and it will pump me up and they'll kind of give me these thumbs ups. And if I'm even better, I'll get a little heart that they love it. And if it's even better, I'll get one of those wow faces that they're just shocked that something like this would happen. Right? It makes me feel good. And then I'll even keep track of how many times people have reshared it, because then clearly I have done something worthwhile for my tribe. Well, the more outrageous the post, of course, the more it pleases our tribe and inflames the opposing tribe. It's all driven by emotion. None of it might be true. I didn't probably stop to see if what I was going to post came from a reliable source and was fact-checked. I just went with my emotions and stuck it out there. Emotions take over, and tribalism then just feeds on itself. Well, Buddhist psychology recognized the role that feelings play in our cognition centuries ago. Our feelings about something trick our minds into assigning an essence to that something, like Creeping Charlie, right? So Wright's solution is Buddhist mindfulness practice. It's a type of meditating to clear your mind and see things more clearly. It helps us remove the essence of things. Instead of a dichotomy where I'm either going to assign an essence of something good or an essence of something bad, Buddhism says that things have no essence. And so we are doing a mindfulness practice to become more mindful of our emotions and the bias that we assign to things that cause us the suffering in life. It's to help us see clearly, not clouded by emotions. And this mindfulness practice can lead to, frankly, two solutions. In the short term, if you have a practice and you do it daily, then it's front of mind and you're thinking about it often, then you're probably going to check yourself when you have that poor, impulsive decision driven by emotion to repost something. And in the longer term, it'll help work to remove the essence of enemy in your probably misperceptions in the first place. So I want to call you now to the Hebrew scripture in Proverbs that I read earlier. If your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink, for by doing this you will heap burning coals on their heads. I love this one. There's a great strength, is what it's saying, in responding kindly to those we believe are the enemy. It will confound them and might spontaneously cause their hair to combust, is how I interpret this verse. They don't expect an act of kindness to be the result of their rude and combustible behavior. As a religious people, we are called to overcome tribalism and to move toward empathy. Not just compassionate, emotional empathy that, like when someone dies or someone's sick, and I'm like, I understand how you feel, but we are called to cognitive empathy, understanding why someone is the way they are. Like my Creeping Charlie story, I had such revulsion because of all my experience in cutting that grass decades ago. As Unitarian Universalists, we do not believe that someone who disagrees with us is an evil person. Rather, given their life experiences, they just perceive things differently. Tribalism is counter to the ideals of Unitarian Universalism, the inherent worth and dignity of everyone, even those with whom we may not agree. Frankly, even unintentionally setting up our own perception of tribalism, of us and them, putting people into groups, and then attributing them based on cognitive bias is at least unbecoming behavior. So now, back to Karen. The person in my opening story is Karen Shupe, a longtime member of the Open Circle Fellowship. Karen and I are so convinced that Wright is correct about mindfulness practice helping to overcome tribalism, she's agreed to start up a new opportunity, a new gathering. And I've asked Karen to tell you about her new initiative to offer a mindfulness practice to our wider fellowship membership as soon as I finish talking. So thank you, Karen. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Who knows? With mindfulness practice, maybe we'll be able to start changing our corner of the world. Or at the very least, we may be able to reduce our cognitive bias and not let Creeping Charlie ruin our life. Amen.